I must admit, when I first heard of Valdemar, the last survivor of a long-forgotten trade caravan, I was skeptical. Who wouldn't be? He was but a half-mad vagrant, rotting away in the deepest, most forsaken corner of a decrepit asylum. His story was passed along in tavern whispers and hushed conversations between those who fancied themselves scholars of the bizarre and improbable. But there was something about the way his name lingered in the air, as if it clung to those who uttered it, that intrigued me. And so, against better judgment, I found myself making the long journey to that wretched place. The asylum was, as one might expect, a miserable stone structure, the air thick with the scent of decay and desperation. The walls dripped with moisture, a perpetual dampness that seemed to gnaw at the very foundations. As I was led deeper into its bowels, the groans of the damned echoed in my ears, a constant, low chorus of suffering that unnerved me more than I'd care to admit. It felt as though the building itself was alive with madness, feeding on the anguish of those trapped within. It was in this place, this forsaken corner of the empire, that I found Valdemar. They kept him isolated, far from the other patients. Not because he was violent, no, the orderlies whispered that he was quite the opposite. He had not spoken for days before my arrival, they said, and even when he did, his words were riddled with nonsense. His was a madness born not of illness, but of terror. The kind of terror that clings to a man's soul, stripping away reason, replacing it with endless fear. I was led to his cell, and when the heavy iron door creaked open, I could see the years of torment etched into his gaunt face. Valdemar sat hunched over on a simple wooden stool, the only piece of furniture in his barren stone chamber. His eyes, once I could see them beneath his tangled hair, were wide, bloodshot, and sunken, staring at nothing, at everything. He looked as though he had not slept in years. And perhaps he hadn't, for how could one sleep after seeing what he had seen? "Valdemar," I said quietly, stepping cautiously into the cell. He did not acknowledge me at first. I could see his lips moving, but no sound escaped them. Muttering to himself, no doubt. A man conversing with ghosts of his past. It took several long moments before his attention drifted toward me. When he finally did meet my gaze, it was as if he were seeing through me, through the walls, even. He had the look of a man who had seen too much and could never unsee it. I had to coax him with soft words, with patience, and eventually the faint spark of recognition flickered in his hollow eyes. I began with simple questions about his past, his trade, and his life before. At first, his responses were nothing more than murmurs, fragmented thoughts, half-formed sentences. It was clear that his mind had been broken, fractured into pieces that could barely be stitched together. But I had been trained for such things. I knew the path of inquiry, how to guide even the most fragile minds back toward coherence. And slowly the tale began to unravel. He spoke of a time long ago when he was but a trader, nothing more than a common man, seeking his fortune in the world. He had joined a caravan of merchants and adventurers, men and women all eager to reach the fabled city of Skavenblight, a place of legend said to have once been a bustling hub of trade and commerce. The idea was simple: recover whatever riches or artifacts might have been left behind after the city had fallen into ruin. Fools, all of them. I had read of Skavenblight, of course. Who hadn't? But only in whispers, only in myth. The city was said to have been destroyed centuries ago, abandoned to time, to darkness, and to the wild things that lurked in the swamps around it. No record spoke of it with any certainty, only that it had been. And then it wasn't. Valdemar's voice shook as he described the early days of the journey, how they traveled for weeks, the landscape becoming more desolate and foreboding with each passing mile. They passed through lands where no one dared live, where the trees themselves seemed to lean in, watching, as though they were warning the caravan to turn back. "They should have," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "We should have." But they didn't. The caravan pushed on, driven by greed, by curiosity, and by arrogance. And as they drew closer to their destination, Valdemar said, the very air seemed to change. It became thick, oppressive, unnatural. The others laughed it off, of course. Men are quick to dismiss their fears when there's wealth to be gained. But Valdemar knew better. He felt it, the weight of something watching them, something old, something terrible. The night before they reached the city, the caravan camped in the shadow of a dark, twisting forest. That was when the noises began. Skittering, Valdemar said, his hands trembling as he spoke. Scratching just beyond the light of our fires. We thought it was animals, wolves perhaps, but it wasn't. It was them, watching us. I leaned in closer, my heart racing despite myself. Them. I knew what he meant, though I didn't want to believe it. The Skaven. Rat men. Creatures of myth, of legend, of madness. No one believed they existed, not truly. But there was something in the way Valdemar spoke, something in his eyes that made me believe he had seen them. They were watching, he repeated, almost to himself. Always watching. And that was when I knew. Whether the Skaven were real or not, Valdemar had seen something. And whatever it was, it had driven him to the brink of madness. The tale was only just beginning, but even then, I felt the chill creeping into my bones. As Valdemar's tale unfolded, I found myself gripped by a peculiar mix of disbelief and dread. His words, at first disjointed and stuttered, slowly gained coherence, as though some dark force compelled him to relive those dreadful days in agonizing detail. I could see in his eyes that he did not wish to recall the events, but some part of him, perhaps buried deep in the corridors of his broken mind, could not help but bring them forth. Skavenblight, he whispered, his voice cracking as he spoke the name. It came from his mouth like a curse, a word not meant to be uttered aloud, and the sound of it a stale air of the cell. We saw it, you know. It wasn't a city anymore. It was something else, something dead. I leaned in closer, not out of politeness, but because I could feel the tension mounting within him, and I dared not miss a single word. It had heard legends of the city, of course, tales told by peasants in the mad, stories of a place swallowed by decay and foulness. But to hear it described by someone who had supposedly seen it with his own eyes, that was something different. Valdemar's fingers twitched, the nails chipped and dirty, clutching the arms of his stool with a desperation that spoke volumes about the terror he had endured. When we first laid eyes on it, Sigmar helped me. We thought we had found the ruins of some ancient city, a place of riches left untouched. But there was nothing, no life, no sound, only the wind and the rats. He shuddered, the mere mention of rats causing his voice to falter. It was crumbling, broken. A city of ghosts, if ghosts could rot and fester in their own filth. The description chilled me. I could picture it in my mind, those empty streets, the sagging buildings, the oppressive silence of a once thriving city now consumed by some unseen blight. But it was not the image of the city that troubled me the most. It was the way Valdemar spoke of it, as though the city itself was alive in some dreadful way. He continued, his voice becoming frantic as he spoke of the caravan's decision to set up camp within the city walls. The others, foolish traders and adventurers, saw no harm in it. They were hungry for riches, believing that ancient treasures lay beneath the grime and rubble. They laughed at the thought of fear, lighting fires and making boasts about the wealth they would soon acquire. But Valdemar, no, he had felt it, even then. The heavy weight of something watching them from the shadows. They were there, in the darkness, he whispered, his gaze distant, as if he were back in that terrible place. I could feel them. I could hear them. It was like they were waiting for us to turn our backs, waiting for us to let down our guard. He fell silent for a moment, his breath shallow and uneven, as if he were reliving that night all over again. The tension in the cell grew thicker, and I found myself unconsciously gripping the edge of my own seat. It was then that he spoke of the skittering. At first it had been faint, barely audible over the crackle of their campfires. It's a sound so slight that no one but Valdemar had noticed. The others had dismissed it, just rats, they said, as if that alone could comfort them in a city long forgotten by the Empire. But to Valdemar, the noise was more than just a nuisance. It was a warning. They were laughing at me. The others, he said, his tone bitter. They thought me mad for being afraid of a few rats, but I knew Sigmar helped me. I knew something was wrong. As the night deepened, the sounds grew louder, more frequent. Scratching at the walls, the scurrying of tiny feet, the faint chittering that carried on the wind. Valdemar had tried to warn the others, but their greed had blinded them. They had refused to listen, and as the night wore on, they began to disappear. One by one, they vanished into the shadows, taken by something unseen. There was no sound of struggle, no cries for help, only the silence that followed, as if the darkness itself had swallowed them whole. Valdemar's hands shook as he spoke of it. They were gone, he muttered. Just gone. I was the only one left. I thought I was going mad, that perhaps I had already crossed the threshold into madness. But then I saw them. The change in his voice was palpable, a trembling whisper that filled me with the same dread I imagined had gripped him that night. They weren't men, he said, his eyes wide with fear. They weren't animals either. They were something else, twisted, broken. Their bodies, like rats, but worse, taller, with hunchbacks and claws that scraped the stone. And their eyes burned red, like coals in the dark. I felt a shiver run down my spine as he spoke those words. The Skaven, the verminous plague that so many had dismissed as legend, as mere folklore. But here was a man claiming to have seen them with his own eyes. They dragged the others into the shadows. Valdemar continued, his voice growing frantic. I saw them, Ehrlich. I saw them rip my friends apart. The things they did to their bodies, twisted them, tore them like they were made of straw. They didn't kill for food or sport. They killed because they could. I leaned closer, my heart racing, though I did not want to admit it. Could it truly be that Valdemar had stumbled upon Skavenblight, and more so, had he encountered the very creatures that lived beneath it? The pieces were beginning to fall into place, though I wished they wouldn't. Valdemar's breathing became shallow, his hands gripping his head as if trying to push the memories away. The red eyes, he muttered, over and over. They were everywhere, watching me, waiting for me to fall asleep so they could take me too. They didn't, I said, my voice betraying my curiosity. How did you escape? At this, Valdemar laughed, a sharp, bitter sound that echoed off the stone walls. Escape? He said, shaking his head. No one escapes. Not really. I ran, yes. I ran until I could no longer feel my legs. I fled the city, but those eyes are still watching me, even here. His words lingered in the air, a terrible realization settling over me. The Skaven weren't just legends, they were real. And they were waiting. Valdemar's eyes, wide with madness, gleamed in the dim light of his cell as he leaned forward, his fingers trembling violently. His ragged breath filled the room, his body twitching with the memory of what he had seen, what he had escaped from, if one could call it an escape. I tried to keep my composure, but the tension was unbearable. I had to know how he made it out of Skavenblight, how he survived, when all the others had been swallowed by the dark. I could not let him falter now. You ran, I said softly, drawing him back from the edge of his mania. You said you fled, but how? What happened? He fixed me with a haunted look, his cracked lips forming a grim smile. I ran, yes, but there's no escaping them, not really. Not ever. There was a tremor in his voice, but he spoke, forcing himself to relive the final, desperate moments of his nightmarish ordeal. I waited, Ehrlich. I waited for the sun to rise, hoping daylight might save me. But it never came. That place. Skavenblight, it doesn't belong to this world. The sun doesn't rise there. The shadows never leave. I knew then that I had to run or die. The rats, those things, they had taken the others. I heard them, dragged away into the dark. Their screams, the sound of claws ripping through flesh. It was everywhere. He shuddered, his hands coming up to clutch his own arms, as if feeling those claws upon his skin. The silence between us stretched as his gaze turned distant, his mind slipping back into that twisted city. But I pressed on, urging him to continue. What did you see when you fled? For a long moment he didn't answer. His breathing slowed, and his gaze flicked to the shadows of the room, as though he feared something might emerge from the walls. Finally, his voice came in a low, broken whisper. I saw them. They were there, standing in the streets, watching me. At first, I thought they were statues, these monstrous, towering figures. But they moved slowly at first, then with purpose. Skaven, but not like the ones from the shadows. Bigger, stronger. Their bodies warped, their skin stretched too tight over their bones, and some carried rusted weapons. Others had nothing but claws. But they all had those eyes, burning red like fire. They wanted me. I could feel it. Valdemar's fingers tightened around his knees, his knuckles white with strain. They were everywhere, he muttered. Everywhere. I could picture it vividly. The abandoned city streets, the crumbling walls, and those Skaven lurking just beyond sight, waiting to pounce. The stories, the rumors, they had all spoken of these creatures as myths, creatures of the underworld that thrived on chaos and despair. Yet here was Valdemar, a living testament to their horrors. His voice grew ragged as he described the moment he began to run. I don't remember how long I ran for. Hours, maybe days. The city felt endless, like I was running in circles, like Skavenblight itself didn't want to let me go. But they were always behind me. Those eyes, those claws scraping against the stone. I could hear them, chasing me. His voice faltered, but they didn't catch me. They didn't have to. The weight of his words hit me like a cold wind. I leaned in, urging him to explain. I saw things, Valdemar whispered, his eyes glassy, lost in the memory. Things I can't explain. As I ran, the buildings changed. They warped, twisted like something was alive beneath the stone. The ground moved beneath my feet, swallowing me, spitting me back out. And in the walls and the cracks, I saw them. Skaven, watching, always watching, but they never touched me. A pause. I didn't dare interrupt. They wanted me to leave, he said finally, his voice hollow. They let me go, because they knew. They knew I'd bring the madness with me. They didn't need to kill me. I was already theirs. I sat in stunned silence, my mind reeling from the implications. The Skaven didn't just hunt, they manipulated. They sowed fear, madness, ensuring that their presence would linger long after their prey had escaped. Valdemar was living proof of that, a man broken by the things he had witnessed, left alive as a living warning to others. But for what purpose? When he said they're still watching, I said slowly, that even now they are here. What do you mean? Valdemar's eyes locked onto mine, the madness behind them undeniable. I see them, Ehrlich. Everywhere I go, they're there, in the shadows. They don't need to hide anymore. They're waiting. Waiting for the time to rise again. And when they do, there won't be anyone left to stop them. His words chilled me to the bone. Was this the ravings of a madman? Or had Valdemar truly seen something beyond our comprehension? I could feel the weight of his fear seeping into me. The insidious suggestion that the Skaven, those verminous creatures of myth, were more than just tales, that they were real, and that they were biding their time. I left the asylum with Valdemar's warning still ringing in my ears. The rats, the eyes, I could feel them too now, watching, always watching. And as I walked back through the dank corridors of that forsaken place, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was following me. Every step, every flicker of the torchlight seemed to cast longer shadows than it should. The scraping in the walls, the faint skittering sounds. Had they always been there? Or had I just never noticed? I shook off the sensation as best I could, but Valdemar's final words echoed relentlessly in my mind. They're still there, beneath us, watching, waiting. I tried to dismiss it, to tell myself it was nothing but the ramblings of a broken man. But deep down I knew better.